So can we have a nice big Bostonian welcome for Andrea Goulet?
Thank you. Everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Excellent. All right. So, quick show of hands. Who here, when they hear about legacy code, goes, oh my gosh, I want to work on that? All right, that's about as many as I expected. So typically, I've been giving talks like this about legacy code for several years now. It's typically about 10% of people in the room. So you guys did not disappoint. And the way that I got into legacy code was a little bit different than kind of your traditional trajectory into the software industry. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about that because it's a fun story. So I went to high school with this guy named Scott. And Scott was president of the computer club. Oop, did we lose the, well, Scott was president of the computer club. He spent every spare minute in the computer lab. He was so excited. He went and got his CS degree. 10 years after high school, like we were friends. His last name's Ford, so we ended up sitting next to each other in like every class, you know. And 10 years later, at our high school reunion, he comes up to me. I got my degree in marketing and sales, and I ended up hacking a CRM system like to pieces and doing all these different Boolean searches in order to actually do my sales better. And I had kept a blog about my ideas about sales, and he came up to me and goes, I have some news for you. You're not actually a salesperson, you're a software person. And I was like, what are you talking about? Because everything you think about is inputs, algorithms, and outputs. And when you boil everything down, that's what software is. By the way, I have a startup. And I've been trying to get my business off the ground for the past year and a half. I have a very specific way that I want to build software. He had been really interested in XP and Agile and all of this. And he's like, no company that I've worked for will ever let me do it. But if I'm a consultant, then people will pay me to do it. But I don't know how to get clients. So you've done sales. I think you'd be great at software. I'll give you 51% of my company because I have zero money. And I think you'd be great, and we've worked together in the past, and this is going to be fun. So, like, immediately I was like, this is really interesting. I've always been interested in software. Like, technology has been really interesting to me. And so, you know, a few years later, I was like, yeah, a few months later, I was like, okay, you know what do we have to lose? Like, we'll go find some clients. If we don't get anything, then that's fine. And it turns out that it's a really interesting problem to solve. And so we got several clients, and then 3 years later, Scott actually asked me another question. He asked me to marry him. And we got married, now we have 2 kids, and that, our 10-year anniversary of our 10-year high school reunion where we reconnected is coming up. So my joke is that if anyone here is single, thanks, and is currently looking for a good pickup line, I'll give you 51% of my software company is the one that happened to work for me. So you guys can do with that what you will. But as, you know, about 3 years in, you know, we, like any startup, we kind of were fumbling and trying to find our market and things like that. So one day, we were sitting on the couch, and we were watching an episode of This Old House. I know that they do a lot of work here in Boston, so that's probably a show that I would expect most of the people here to know. And Scott said this really interesting thing. He said, I want to do that. And I said, you want to quit software and go to remodeling houses? He goes, no. I want to spend my career cleaning up other people's code. He goes, that's my dream job. If I could do nothing else, I would go into existing software systems and make them better. And so the marketing person in me goes, is that really what you want to do? Because that's a big target market, and you talk about product market fit, I think we can make this work. So that's what we did, and that's kind of how I discovered legacy code. But what was really interesting was that once I started diving into legacy code, I mean, I had never heard, like, when I thought of legacy, I thought of things that were good, right? I thought, like, I'm going to build a legacy. I'm going to hand something down to my kids, right? I'm going to create something that I want to pass down that has something of value. You know, I was in a sorority. Like my daughter, if she wants to join that sorority, she's a legacy status. Like those are good things. You know, I think about like my ancestors and the people who are going to come after me and before me. Like there was a lot of good stuff. And then I read Michael Feather's book, Working Effectively with Legacy Code, and started digging into the software side, and I realized, oh, in software, legacy code is bad. Like, I probably should have figured this out before I said yes to this company, but I was like, you know what, my background is in marketing, and I love a good challenge, so I'm going to take it upon myself to make legacy code sexy again. So I'm going to make legacy code fun, because Scott had this true passion around it. So when we think of legacy code in the context of software, we think of things like big balls of mud, right? Dirt field. I was talking to one of my clients today, and he's like, oh yeah, that's an actual term in solar. Like that is, like if you've worked on a parking lot, or if you've worked in in landscape at all, like that means that if you've had a gas station or something, like you can't develop on that. Like it's just so old. You've got to do so much work to the ground to actually make it usable again. We think of like the kitchen sink and like how like it's just this big old mess. We talk about it in spaghetti code. We've referred to it as shanty towns. Like there's typically not a lot of positive terms that come to mind when you think of legacy code. And so as we started diving into this, I was like, this is a really interesting thing. Because here I have Scott, who this is his dream job. Is it the code that's the problem? Or is it the culture around the code that is making people not want to work on it? And so that's what we're going to kind of dive in today. And at the end, you know, we'll have some room for discussion in here. This is meant to be a little bit more interactive. And we're going to ask, like, is there a way that we can think about this differently? So hopefully maybe there'll be a few other hands that go up at the end. So as I was putting this together, I was like, okay, over the past 10 years, I've noticed there's kind of 7 deadly software sins. Like, think of these as anti-patterns. If you want to create a culture where all of your developers are burnt out, no one is happy, and you're not delivering software on time or in budget, these are the things that you need to do. So the first is shame and blame. Shame, I love Brené Brown's definition. So shame is the deep feeling of feeling unworthy and that you don't belong. How many people have ever felt like that in a software team? Yeah. I walked into my very first software conference 10 years ago, and there were 400 people in the room, and I was one of 2 women. I was like, whoa, what happened? Like, and then I was like, okay, well, I'll learn on Stack Overflow. That was kind of a shocker, right? Like, I got a lot of feedback that was just like, you should have done this way, you know, and just really critiquing, not even critiquing, but a lot of shame around like, you're stupid. You don't know what you're doing. You should have stayed in marketing. Like, people in software don't like marketers. I promise we're nice. And there is this feeling of feeling like an other, right? Especially if you don't have a computer science degree, right? Or if you're trying to learn. And I think that's one of the beauties of Agile is that the whole emphasis on cross-functional teams breaks that down a little bit. That's why I was like, yes, I will do mob programming. Because mob programming was actually the very first time where I didn't feel like an other. I felt like an equal. And I learned so much and so rapidly. So for me personally, that was incredibly valuable. So I was like, yes, let's teach lots of people how to do this. But in addition to shame, you have blame. And so blame happens, it's the discharge, like when you feel that pain of not feeling like you belong, you have to discharge it somehow. And so you end up attacking people, right? There's this feeling like, I'll toss out a name, I don't normally do this, but like there's been in the news lately, like Linus Torvald, right? Like if I pull up Git, right, in like the whole Linux environment, so if I'm using Git, as my source control system, and I'm curious and I want to see a history of who's changed something on that project, what command do I run? Git blame. Like, that is how baked in this stuff is into our culture, right? And so what that does is it gives me a small cognitive priming that says, these people were stupid. They didn't know what they were doing, right? And that in itself can be a little harmful. So the next one is operations and maintenance, right? No surprise here with waterfall, right? But like the way that we structure how we budget software projects can really impact whether or not people find joy in that. And so typically when software releases were longer, you would see, and this still happens today, you move from development of a project into O&M, which if you guys have ever seen the movie Office, like The Office, like I think of the guy with the stapler who it's like, go into the basement, you know, just, I'm gonna ignore you, like, yeah, we kind of need you, but like, you know, we're just gonna pretend like you don't exist. Like there's very little growth in operations and maintenance. It's a keep the lights on, and so that's where good software careers go to die. Like there's not a lot of growth there. There's not a lot of experimentation there. And so there's very little incentive for people to want to do that. So restructuring that, I think that there's a lot of good stuff in kind of the whole idea of digital transformation, because that's taking what you have and rather than just saying, oh, go to O&M, it's all kind of part of the same thing. And just recognizing that software is always changing. It's never going to be stagnant. And I think the Agile movement has really helped with that too. There's a really good article by Sarah Allen, who from 18F, and it's called Operations and Maintenance is an Anti-Pattern. Totally worth the read, and it goes into more specifics about that. So next is short-term thinking, right? If you want to stress everybody out and really diminish your business value, think only about the short term and never about the long term. Because what you will end up doing is creating so much technical debt that you can't make changes, right? Technical debt is the result of short-term thinking. It's hacking something together now and just imagining that it's not going to really have an impact later, right? And so this is fine if we're kind of in a startup and we're like experimenting, exploring, and like there's a place to accrue technical debt. But you know, in Ward Cunningham's definition, you know, the problem is when that's never paid down. And so what happens is that if you don't start thinking about things in the long term, then you can really hurt yourself in the short term because you just can't move at all. Like entire systems can be brought to a standstill because the entire organization is so focused on short-term thinking. Next is hero culture, right? So how many people have ever seen this? There's a production issue, right? And somebody has to stay up until 4 in the morning, right? Get it, right? That's pretty common. I'm seeing a lot of nodding heads. How many times do those people who sacrifice their family, they're the ones who get rewarded, right? Do the people who prevent that from happening ever get the same type of hero status? Do we reward the people who are keeping things running smoothly? Or are we rewarding the heroes, the 10Xers, the ninjas, and are we saying, oh, well, because you are this, like, you're better than everyone else? And guess what? When you have a hero culture, you create an incentive for people to create problems so that then they can get rewarded for fixing them, right? So getting rid of the hero culture is a huge issue, but it's a little counterintuitive. Like I know, like we try to keep it, like we focus a lot on kind of the long-term thinking, and like our company tries to do the anti of all this. But it's still hard because if something does happen, like you want to shout out because that person did sacrifice, but at the same time, it's like, am I rewarding the right things? So just paying attention to that. So next is urgency and firefighting. So I had someone call and ask if we could help, and they said, our hair is on fire, we have a huge issue, and I need this issue resolved by next week. And it's like, well, we're not really the right fit for that, right? We're more the longer term, like we're about fire prevention. And I've worked in so many companies where you can't actually do anything strategic because you're so busy being reactive and just putting out all these fires and fighting all these red flags. And that's exhausting. That leads to burnout. That leads to not being able to use your prefrontal cortex, which is where you're going to get your best decision making, because you are constantly in a fight or flight situation. So part of this is creating a sense of calm. Like one of our core values at Corgibytes is calm the chaos, right? There is going to be chaos. There is going to be change. But can we take a deep breath and then think about the best way strategically to move through it rather than just being very reactionary? And that's a challenge. Next is fear. There's a lot of fear. And part of the reason that there's a lot of fear is because there's a lot of shame and blame, right? So we're afraid to trust people on our team. Trust means that we have to be vulnerable. We have to give something up to that trust that somebody else is going to execute on our actions, or somebody else is going to help us achieve our goals. And if we don't have that, we're afraid. We create these silos. We create these walls. Like, marketers are evil. I don't want to talk to them, right? Or the other people on our team, like we don't share code, we don't have that collaboration back and forth. There's fear that your skills are going to stagnate, right? So if you are in operations and maintenance, like you're nervous that you're going to be irrelevant later. Like in all of these, if you're a hero culture, there's a fear of if I don't focus on features or if I don't sacrifice my family, then I'm not going to be rewarded and I won't get a promotion, right? So fear kind of underlies all of these things. And then the last is that in general, and this is outside of the software industry, this is more, like this is broad across everyone, is that we value, as a culture, as a society, we value innovation over maintenance. There's a great podcast on Freakonomics called Hail the Maintainers that has Andrew Russell and Lee Vinsel, and they're both academics. And they wrote an article of the same name, and it talks about this issue, about how we end up getting so much more for our buck if we focus on maintenance, but the people who are doing the maintenance very rarely get that recognition that you get with the people who are what we call makers, right? So think about, like, when I just say makers, you imagine already, you're like, oh yeah, Make Magazine, hackathons, like we have all of these different things that focus on creating something new, but it's not polished. But it's good enough, right? It's like, it's getting this new idea out into the world, right? And so when I was talking through with Scott about how do we describe this, he's like, I wish there was something else other than maker, because I don't feel like I describe that. And it's like, well, guess what? We can create that. What do you want to be called? So we went through a lot of different kind of terminologies, and we settled on the term mender, right? So there are folks, the people who raise their hands, like, I'm a mender. I love taking a 80% solution and just working on it over time, making it more stable, making it more scalable, making it more secure, nurturing it, making it feel like it's going to last for a really long time. And we need both types of different people, right? I sometimes think of the maker-mender spectrum a little bit like introverts and extroverts, right? If the whole world was an extroverts, like I was in a group once, like I was in a leadership class, and they organized us by personality type, and they had basically all of the people who were extroverts in one group, and then all of the people who were like, introverts and more quiet in another group, and like the people who were extroverts, like it was awful because like it was a cacophony, everybody was yelling, like we couldn't get anything done. And then the poor people who were introverts were over in this side of the room. They were really, really quiet. So like we all need to work together in integrated groups, and it's the same with makers and menders, right? Makers bring that like aliveness energy, right? They are able to, I'm honestly more of a maker than a mender personally, but Scott is very, very much a mender, so I'm an advocate for him. And we need each other, right? Because if we don't have people who are starting that energy, then nothing will get created. But if we also don't have people who are taking what we're creating and scaling it, we don't get growth. We don't get stability. We don't get maturity. We don't get efficiency, right? We don't get a lot of the good things that come along with it. So as part of the, oh, do you need to do something?
The video.
The video?
Can you minimize them?
Minimize the,
Everybody's seeing them.
oh, sorry, yes.
Thank you.
Where is the mouse? Oh my gosh, it's this little invisible thing. Let me see if I do. Nope, that didn't do it. Are you guys okay just seeing the video? Me going forward?
Move it to the side.
I can't find the mouse to,
Oh, it's a feature.
Don't worry about
yeah.
Some legacy code.
I know, right? So, so as part of this, idea to reinvigorate legacy code, it was like, Scott, let's start a podcast where we interview people who love legacy code, and we share the stories about the benefits of legacy code, and we share the stories about why people enjoy working on legacy code. So it's been 3 years. We've interviewed just over 50 people. And so for tonight, what I did was kind of, I don't know if this is statistically sound right now or statistically significant, but I'm starting to see some kind of themes emerge, so I thought we could kind of go over those a little bit. So some of the guests that we've had over the years, you can go to your favorite podcast place, it's probably there. But we've had people like Michael Feathers, who wrote Working Effectively with Legacy Code. I asked him about shame and if he would do the same thing again. It's a good one. We have Woody Zuhl from mob programming, talked to him a little bit about that. Scott Hanselman, Rebecca Worfsbrox, who wrote the, if you ever heard anything blank-driven development, she was the one who started that framework. Diana Larson, who wrote the Agile Fluency Model. So, and we're always looking for new people, and especially elevating people who we don't hear a lot in the software industry. So specifically, if you have anybody in mind who's a woman, person of color, somebody with a disability, somebody who's in the LGBTQ community, those are the people I would love to elevate their voice. So anybody, you can go to the website, legacycode.rocks, and just send us a quick email, and we would love to get more people on the podcast. If you're outside of that, that's fine too, but I just love plugging that we're specifically looking to elevate voices who might not be heard all the time. And at the end of every episode, we ask every single guest, what do you love about legacy code? So these are the themes that emerged. The number one reason, and this was by far and away, I would say almost, I didn't actually break down the math, but I would say about 60 to 70% of the guests said this in some way or shape or form, is that the work matters. What I'm doing is valuable. I know that there are users out there who are going to see or be impacted by the work that I do. And I remember this, I felt this is part of the reason why I enjoy working within legacy code, is because I used to work, one of my jobs for a while was I was in social media, and we were when you talk about something that doesn't feel very enduring, and it felt like a veneer, for me personally. It was I didn't know if this thing, I loved the process of creating it, but there was nobody using it yet. It was still just an idea in my head. And when you work on a legacy system, you have thousands, sometimes millions of people who are counting on you. We had one client that was in the health industry, and the code that we were writing was helping to diagnose leukemia in a more efficient way. That makes you feel good. At the end of the day, you're I'm doing something really important. And legacy code doesn't stick around unless it's doing something really important. So the work was really meaningful. there are a bunch of quotes from some different people. So, for each of these, there's like, 5 or 6 different themes. So I'm going to let you guys, can you guys see all of that? Oh, now I got to move my little Zoom thing because you can't read it. All right. Here's what we're going to do.
Want to do this remotely now?
Yay.
Yeah, but now you don't have nothing.
There we go. I just still have that little talking.
But you can come back to full screen now.
I'll put it down here at the bottom.
Whoops.
There we go. Okay, cool. So take a minute, if ever, and I'll read a couple of themes, but then I'd love, especially the people who raise their hand, to say, does this resonate? Does this make sense? And even if you haven't thought of legacy code in this way, is there a project that you're working on now where it's like, okay, yeah, I am doing something meaningful? So Esther Derby, she was like, it makes my world run, right? Pretty much. And when we think about legacy code, let's also think about the definition. It does not have to be code that is 50 years old. It's code that you wrote, right? It's code that is existing, that's either you in the future or somebody else is going to have to take care of, right? So definitions vary. We actually have a podcast coming out soon exactly about debating all the definitions. But the one that I like is code that's in production that needs to be taken care of, right? And when we say that, it has nothing to do with whether or not it's good or bad. It just has to say it exists and people use it, right? And then that brings it back to you can leave a good legacy, you can leave a bad legacy, right? We can talk about the quality of the legacy that you're leaving, but it's just that you're passing something along. It's the durable thing that you're passing along. So Rebecca Worsbrox talks about how much it contributes value. I love Jared Santo, so his podcast is Changelog, so if you guys are ever interested in open source software, that's a really great podcast to listen to. And he was like, it kept staying valuable and it's still paying dividends today. That's like superpowers, right? And you can think of it in this way. So, and Woody Zuhl said, the hardest part is finding the value. So when you work on legacy code, you've already done the hard part. The rest of it is keeping it going. So I'll open it up to y'all and our nice microphone volunteer. What are some things, if you have any thoughts on creating value? Yes, over here.
Sometimes thought in talking about software maintenance and code that it's actually in a way either redevelopment or further development in disguise.
Yep.
It's actually, in a way, it is software development, kicking version 1 to version 2.
Yep.
And sometimes I'm thinking, okay, so what's the difference between quote-unquote maintaining legacy code and essentially coming out, redeveloping the next and greatest version?
Yep. Yeah.
I sometimes think, what's the difference between maintenance and actual development?
Exactly. Yeah. It all comes down to the same thing. That's great. Anybody else have any thoughts about, we'll just take maybe 1 or 2 for each theme. Right here. Bill.
I think one of the biggest issues is constraints.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a clean sheet,
Mm-hmm.
there are very few constraints, although you have to make it work, and there's probably a lot of stuff to get going. But there's a lot of code there already. Then you have constraints where you need to not only make sure you're not breaking things, but it works a lot better if you can do things in the style of the person who wrote it first.
Yep.
And that way, someone else reading it can say, oh, this is all by the same person. Maybe
Yep.
10 different people, but if it's all by, if you keep the style correct, then you can it's much easier to maintain over a longer period of time.
Yeah. We're going to see that theme come up in a little bit. That's a good segue. We're going to hold, and then I'll take questions after each theme, but I just want it for time's sake. And we'll have lots of time for questions at the end, too. And then I'm hanging out at the pub after, so we can chat then, too. So next is that it's challenging and fun. right? Like, when you dive into a legacy system, you don't know what you're going to get, right? I love doing the New York Times crossword puzzle. Like, I do it every day, and I get so excited. And the thing that I like is when it's hard, right? If anybody else does, like Monday puzzles, I'm like, yeah, I can breeze through this in like 15 minutes, you know. But the Saturday puzzles, I'm like, oh, this really challenges my brain. And I like that feeling of being challenged. And if you like that feeling of being challenged, there is so much to love in legacy code, because you are constantly coming up against problems that people think are unsolvable. But guess what? You can solve them, and then you feel really good about that. So some quotes around this, like Llewellyn Falco says, I like puzzles, right? And it's that feeling of fulfillment. Declan Whelan is like, this is, you know, it creates a really challenging experience to refactor something that is safe, right? It's easy to kind of create something and, okay, it works. But can you modify something, make sure that it's still stable and refactored, and that it's all secure? Brian Beecham's like, I love going to messes and untangling them and fixing them up, right? It's a lot of joy. And then constraints. So Jan Jorgensen, who was a recent guest, he talks exactly about this, about you can find a lot of creativity in constraints. So if you talk to artists, this is big in the like web design and user experience kind of realm, is that a lot of people who focus on the blue sky thinking will actually give themselves constraints because it supercharges their creativity. There's a great tool for web development, like front end, more like web design, called constraint cards. And so like if you're stumped, because if you've got a blank page, you're literally like just so overwhelmed with, I could do anything. Where do I start? So a constraint card actually focuses you. So it would be things like create everything in a monochromatic color scheme. And it's like, okay, and then you start from there, right? And so the same thing happens with legacy code. You have a lot of constraints, and therefore you get to expend that creativity. And so Michael Feathers was like, you know, saying how he's an insight junkie and he loves like diving into the code and then feeling that aha moment. And I think that's what menders go for. Like, it's that small aha moment, and it's like this level of personal achievement. Like, yeah, I did that. That was really cool. So seeing that, you know, red go to green if you're doing test-driven development, like, there's an immense amount of satisfaction there. Any other thoughts? I'll open it up for a couple of thoughts around like legacy code being fun and challenging. Over here.
Most of my background has been in software internationalization and localization.
Ooh, fun.
It was retrofitting legacy code to support non-English languages
Yes.
when the crap has been hard-coded throughout the
Yes.
It was just wonderful. It was a great experience. Absolutely wonderful.
Yeah, and so did you find that feeling of like, it's really challenging, and it's like, what is it about it being, like, when you say wonderful, like, tell us a little bit more about why you found it wonderful.
Part of it was because of the end user market, which meant that we were now actually enabling the product to run in non-English languages in their own environments, including, which at the time were odd languages like Japanese, woohoo, and then moving into Arabic.
Yeah.
Just the whole complex language field of
Yeah.
Arabic and Thai and
Yeah.
it was fascinating unto itself, but just that being able to create something that became more usable than what it had been before. I
Yeah.
guess the best way to describe it.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing. Sorry to make you run. You're getting your exercise today.
The life cycle of bugs is that you have much more bugs when the program is new.
Yeah.
Over time, the bugs are going down. So old legacy code should be bug-free by now.
Yeah, you would think. But I think it's layman's laws that talk about, like, as long as you've got people using the system, it puts pressure on the system to change. And so therefore, you will always have bugs. Because you're always going to have to change it because there's changing environments. Like, users are going to demand different things. So the only time that you would actually get to bug zero is if you don't have people using the system. And I don't know that then you have legacy code, then I think you have a different problem. So, yeah. But great, thanks for sharing. All right, so the next one is it builds skills, right? I have a friend of mine who calls this resume-driven development, right? And there are so many interesting things in legacy code because you're not stuck to just like one thing, right? So, the first language I learned was Ruby. And so, I knew how to kind of get started in Ruby. So guess what I reached for anytime I needed to build something? I just reached for Ruby, right? But when you're in a legacy system, you've got all these different types of integrations. You've got, this database over here working on with this system over here, and you've got to make it all work. And so you're constantly countering challenges that you didn't think that you would run into, and you're needing to level up your skills. So these are some things that people have said. So Purnima Vijayashankar, she founded femgineer.com, and she also was the founding engineer at mint.com, which got bought by Intuit. So she was the very first engineer there. She actually named the company. And she said that one of her favorite things was seeing the code that she wrote early in her career, and then 6 years later going back and being like, oh, yeah, I wouldn't code it that way anymore. And then just using that instead of that shame-based language of I was a bad developer when I wrote that, instead looking at it as an opportunity for growth and saying, wow, look at how far I've come in the past 6 years. And look at how much I've grown and look at how much I've evolved. Tim Doherty says he doesn't call it legacy code, he calls it inherited code. And it's this shared learning experience. And then Lisa Crispin talks about how she likes being able to dig in and learn because then it helps the team avoid pitfalls later. Right? And I think this is, again, where, plug for mob programming. Mob programming is a great way to level up skills. And the nice thing about mob programming, especially on a legacy system, is that you've got all that different shared knowledge and shared experience about a system. And the other thing is that you don't have to keep the cognitive load. The team shares the cognitive load. So you don't have to necessarily keep it all in your head. Because when you're diving into a legacy system, you can go deep, right? And you've got a model within a model within a model within a model. And I call that sometimes the Inception level. Have anybody seen the movie Inception? So Scott, this is a little off tangent, but it's a funny story. So early in my career, my background is in marketing. So I was very used to, in my early career, walking up to colleagues and going, you got a sec? I need to talk to you about something. And after working with me for about 18 months, Scott was working on a problem, and he's very quiet, but you can just tell, and I swear he wanted to flip the desk over, and he just gave me this look of I do now, what do you want? I could tell. And I'm pretty sure most of you who develop software, if somebody comes up and asks you got a sec, how do you feel? Right? So I think it was Brian Graham, he talked about the differences between managers and makers. So if you are focusing on a project, if you're diving into legacy code, you've got to think about something, I've got this, kind of method that I'm thinking of, and then I've got these classes that I have to consider, and I've read this documentation over here, and I've got to make sure that, I've got it all in my brain. And then if you're way deep down, somebody comes over and says, hey, you got a sec, just the mental load to even answer that question, because do I really have a second or do I not? Does Andrea really mean a second or does she really mean 20 minutes? Because she can go on and talk for a while. And so just the process of saying it, you watch your entire mental model leave, and it can sometimes take an hour to get back, right? And you just watch all of that work. So one of the things we did was we started using Inception, we talked about this. We actually used marriage counseling a lot to help us as business owners. That's a whole separate talk. But that's one of the things we learned was creating this kind of shared language. So we started using the idea of inception levels. Because if I just went up and instead of saying, hey, you got a sec, if I just say, what's your inception level? And he goes, 9, 9 being high, or I'm interruptible. I'm okay, I walk away. And then he finds me later. So anyway, that's that. So next we've got empathy, which I love, right? I'm a trained marketer, right? Marketing is all about empathy. It's all about understanding other people, right? Which is something that I really, really enjoy. It's figuring out what What do people love and what makes them tick? And so I was really surprised when this theme came about, but a fair number of people, I would say at least half the people, talked about the people. It wasn't just about the code, it was remembering the people. So just like we heard over here, it's about being able to think about the ways that people had coded before. And can I have a consistent style, right? Thinking about the people who are going to come after you. Can I write code in a way that is going to be easy for somebody else, maybe myself, right, in 6 months, that is going to help them and be clear to them? So Heidi Helfand talks about how it's, different voices that are building something together. Brian Brannigan talks about how he imagines those human beings, like it's not just the bits and bytes, right? And if you think about it, if you're writing software in anything that is a compiled language, you are writing for humans, right? You are using language that was designed to be compiled down into ones and zeros. You're not writing in straight out binary, and that's for a reason. It's to make it easier for human beings to understand. So if you kind of think about it a little bit differently, you're not coding for the computer, right? You're coding for all of these other people. You're coding for yourself 6 months from now. You're writing documentation so that it's easier for somebody who's coming onto the team to get up and running quicker, right? You're getting your developer environment squared away and quickly so that you can, have people contribute their ideas faster, right? So all of these different things, it comes down to people. And the last, I didn't do comments for that one. Anybody have anything to share about that one? About people?
Yeah, I definitely feel like if it's an opportunity to have empathy for the people who came before.
Yeah.
As opposed to like, what is this pile of crap? But it is also kind of like your future self. Like,
yeah.
You're going to need this, and I think that's super helpful. Like when you take that opportunity to look back, you're like, wait.
Yeah.
I know everybody's had the experience of like writing code and say, who wrote this? And it turns
Yeah.
out it was them.
So you run Git blame and it's yourself. Yeah. Yeah. I've done that a fair amount of time. Yes.
When I'm called in as a consultant to fix a problem, the manager who called me in might be the person who actually wrote this horrible code back then. So I have to fix it to make it work the way he wanted it to work.
Yeah. The other thing about empathy that's really interesting is that the research shows, so again, Brene Brown, because she studies trust, vulnerability, empathy, and shame. The research shows that empathy is the antidote for shame. So the way she describes it is if you take shame and you put it in a petri dish and you cover it with secrecy, like basically all the anti-agile things, right? It'll grow exponentially. If you take shame and you douse it with empathy, it cannot grow. So if we want to fix the shame and blame problem, we need to focus on empathy. Everyone, right? And empathy is the ability to consider somebody else's point of view. There's actually, again, this is another talk, but there's actually two different types of empathy. There's emotional empathy, which is the feeling state that you have. And then there's also cognitive empathy, which is the type of empathy that I learned as a marketer, which is I'm going to do a lot of research, understand your point of view, and then try to take an action that is going to help you, right? That is going to meet your needs. And the nice thing about cognitive empathy is it is a technical skill. We can learn this, right? This is not that's the marketing people's job over there. Like, this is the work that we need to do, and it's the work that Agile was built on. So the next theme that came up was hunting for treasure, right? So there is an archaeological, an anthropological element to this, because it's digging into the past. You can put on your Sherlock Holmes or Indiana Jones hat, whichever you feel like, and you can consider this an adventure, right? You're diving in to somebody else's experience, and you're looking at the artifacts that they left behind. So one of the things that we have on our Legacy Code Rocks community is we have a GitHub repo called Awesome Legacy Code. And it's things like the Apollo mission, right? That's been open source now. It's like we can go in and we can look at Margaret Hamilton's work and see what she did and get a thought, like, how did she go about this, right? Like MS-DOS, like Prince of Persia. There's all these like really great things that were built that we can go through and we can look at and we can read and we can look at as standards, just like you have jazz standards or just like you look through literature to look at, how Yeats or Shakespeare or, all of these different people wrote. You can do the same thing with legacy code. So some ideas here. So Coraline Ada Emke talks about, it's an archaeological pursuit, and it's context and cultural knowledge. That's what you're uncovering. Catalina, who's actually my director of engineering, she talks about it as a treasure hunt. And there's this great episode where we interview her because she had to reverse engineer a data structure from the binary files. And when I talk to most people about that, the normal response I get is, that makes me want to scratch my eyeballs out. But with Catalina, she's like, this was the most fun project I've ever worked on because it was really exciting. It was a treasure hunt. Jennifer Wong was like, I get a sense of who used to work here. And that, again, connects me to that kind of shared humanity. It's not just about the code, it's about the people. And Nat Price talks about how legacy code might often be the only place where that knowledge is captured, right? Is in the code itself, right? Thinking about it, like those stored procedures, that's a type of documentation, right? And abstracting that out sometimes is hard, but being able to really dig in and read that. So any thoughts there about like legacy code being a treasure hunt or a detective story?
Like a piping system, chemicals flowing in a machine, and there were labels underneath. And the problem, they called it the Chinese writing problem. The labels they looked like Chinese, but they were supposed to be English. And after I looked at it enough and I drew a picture of them, I realized, there was 2 different labels superimposed. And then I could figure out which 2 they were.
Yeah. And so how did you feel once you figured that out?
Pretty good.
Yeah, right? Yeah, so the thing is that it's not to put a veneer over it, right? It's not to say that, this stuff is awful and like, the point of this is that you can change your perspective, right? You can change the way you think about things. And oftentimes, like I said in the beginning, is it the code itself? Or is it the culture that the code that you're working within, right? Because if you have the time and the resources and the ability to research and the ability to fail, right? All of the different things that Agile promotes, then legacy code becomes fun. But if you've got like, somebody breathing down your neck saying you've only got 10 minutes to solve this, you have no money and no budget, and oh, by the way, you can't, like, I expected you to come in here and be an expert in this already, like, there's no ability to learn, then that's when it becomes not fun. So part of it is that you've got to set up the culture so that this stuff can be fun. So how can you learn how to love legacy code, right? So these are the 5 habits of happy menders, right? Some that we've gone over already. The first one is learn about the business value, right? Value, like I said, was the #1 thing. And so if you can learn how to describe the work that you are doing in terms that the people who are writing the checks understand, you will get the resources, right? So part of that is being able to understand what are the business challenges that your organization is dealing with, right? And I found that, it usually falls into one of these 3 buckets. It's usually about increasing revenue. So maybe how can I get more customers, right? It might be a sales issue, or it might be a customer attrition issue, right? But how can I get more money, right? Another one is how can I lower costs? Because if we look at profit, which is like if you're the business person, you're looking at that bottom line, all that is revenue minus expenses. So if I want to be more profitable, I want to find ways to either increase revenue or decrease expenses. So how can you save money, right? So it might be, like I think of it, I use the metaphor sometimes as like a house. right? Like if you know you're going to be in a house for a long time and you've got windows that are really inefficient, you might have to spend a fair amount of money replacing the windows, but you're going to get that back over time, right? And so being able to explain some of these things in more metaphor so that people get it becomes a really important thing. And then the third thing that usually business people care about is managing risk, right? And that honestly like impacts the first two. So for example, Zoom had like a big, right? It was funny because like I read yesterday, I had like 3 developers email me all at the same time about the article that came out about Zoom's issue. And then I checked my email and I had somebody, because we use Zoom, and I had a salesperson from Zoom saying, hey, do you want to take advantage of our promotion? And I was like, I don't know, I'm considering leaving right now. And like that's a real thing, right? So if you don't have your security stuff, if you've got a big security breach, that directly impacts your customer acquisition. Right? So if you can start explaining these things, and it's not necessarily you have to go get a business degree or anything like that, but it's being able to understand what makes your business run, and then that's where you're going to get the highest value to be able to get funding to go about and doing some legacy code. So the next one is about thinking about games and treasure hunts. So Karen McGonigal has a really interesting book called Super Better. And so she walks through, she's a cognitive scientist. And so she walks through, she had I think, a brain injury, a traumatic brain injury. And it was hard for her to get out of bed and just do daily life. So she developed a game called Super Better. And it was things like, I get 3 points if I go take a shower, right? But it's a mental trick. And it's turning it from, oh my God, I got to be out of bed, I've got the biggest headache. That feeds shame and blame, right? That makes things worse. But if you can mentally turn that around and kind of a little bit of trickery in terms of your brain and start, this is why gamification is such a big deal. But it really does work, right? If you can think about those unit tests and like looking at that bar and seeing if it's green, like you can start to see your progress, right? And then you start feeling like, okay, this is good, right? And especially if we're practicing continuous improvement, we're looking at those small wins over time, right? And turning those small wins and celebrating them is a big deal. And then you can start to think of it as less of a burden and more of a fun activity. Thinking of other people, practicing empathy, right? Remembering that we're not necessarily writing software for the compiler. We're writing software that is going to impact the lives of the people who are using it. It's going to be used by other people. Legacy code, you are the custodian of this code at a particular moment in time. There may have been people who came after you, and more than likely, or there may have been people who came before you, and more than likely there will be people who come after you. You're not going to be the only person who ever works on this code base. So thinking it in terms of a custodial thing, and where you're going to nurture it and you're going to do the best you can with what you've got, but connecting to those people who came before you and after you, that helps you redefine the way that you think about legacy code. Remembering the past and the future. Again, remembering that you are this one dot, right? And every day it's a new dot, right? And so you can think about not only the other people, but also your own path on that dot, right? So if we think about Purnima's talk about how, 6 years ago she was writing this type of code, and now she knows how to do things a lot more differently. And you can watch your own progress evolve over time because you have the artifacts in the code itself. And then finally, focusing on learning. So in addition to making it a game, where can you level up your skills, right? How can you go into pairing? How can you use mobbing? How can you find ways? And a great thing here is Carol Dweck's work on a growth mindset. This becomes really, really critical when you're working on legacy systems. So with her work, she talks about how there are 2 different types of mindsets. There's a fixed mindset where you believe that you are born with all of the skills, right? And this happened to me, right? Because I was like, oh, I'm not good at math, right? Oh, I'm not a software person. I'm a communications person, right? And there's a whole different reason that like I self-identified that way. But I believed for a very long time, like I just can't do software because I'm not born that way, right? Well, it turns out that's not true at all, right? Yeah, we have our strengths, and yeah, we have things that we're kind of, better competencies, but we can learn things, right? If we dedicate it, if we do the research, like we can get better at things. And so rather than thinking that your skills are set in stone, instead imagining how you're adaptable and how you're going to grow. And the magical word here is yet. So it's saying, I don't understand React yet, right? I don't really know how to refactor yet, right? And then that gives you the power to actually go out and seek resources and try new things. So now that we've kind of dived into this a little bit, I want to challenge you, and I want to open it up for a little bit of discussions and Q&A to think about what's your new definition of legacy code? Is it a little bit more positive? Hopefully. Are there more people who are like, okay, legacy code doesn't sound so bad, as long as you've got the right, soil, I think of it, to support it. Like, it's a plant. It's something that's going to grow. And if you grow it in soil where you don't have a lot of these good cultural things, then it's going to be a challenge. But if you've got more of a good culture and a good healthy culture, then you can thrive. So that's what I've got. And there's my info. And we'll open it up for comments and questions.
One of the other I would call 8 deadly sin, and that's long hours, and not taking a break, not thinking about what you're doing, just coding. And there's a big difference between thinking. There's a big difference between thinking about what you're doing a good solution, and coding.
Yeah. I think that gets under, like, if I was to put that kind of under some of the existing ones, it's the short-term thinking. Right? So it's recognizing like, oh, I'm going to get sucked in, but realizing that you're actually more effective if you take a break. And then also the hero culture. Because a lot of times in organizations, people think of people as resources and like trying to just get as many hours out of them instead of thinking, how can I get the best out of them? And that is definitely when you have people who are fresh. So, good point.
Do I have this on? Okay.
Oh.
No, here, he's got it. There you go. Redundant mics. What a concept. And that's how do you now define legacy code? And I was thinking of a question to ask, and all of a sudden it clicked in. Well, maybe what it is the nth edition of the book ready to be edited into the N+1 edition.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, thinking of it in terms of editions. I like that a lot. We've got one right here.
You talked a lot about
It's on.
about having empathy and being able to love the legacy code and fix it. But a lot of times when we speak with management, the first thing they want to do is that how can you share the legacy, or what they really want to understand is that how is the legacy impacting us. So for example, I have had situations where some piece of mainframe code, it used to take 3 weeks to find out where is that one line of code I have to change, and 3 weeks to now test it after that one line of code is changed, which tells me that the code is not very fungible. I mean, similarly, there are other examples of how this code is not extensible. To me, that is legacy because it prevents me from further developing that code. And so how do you solve this problem? I mean, we talked about glorifying legacy, but how do you solve the problem?
Yeah, so I'm going to admit that I was one of those people. And I think a big piece of it is being able to describe the value. So figuring out what do they fear? What are they afraid of? Is that person nervous about losing their job or losing their reputation? Like, what is driving the need for urgency? What is driving, and being able to articulate, and then once you've got a shared understanding, and saying, okay, I hear, like this is where that empathy piece comes in, because you're doing the data capture to figure out what do you care about. Right? And this is beyond just the developers. This absolutely is for the people in the business, the people who are using your software. This is a skill that you can use with any person, right? But really understanding, like, what is it that you care about, and what is it that you're worried about? And then once you get that understanding, then you can start to problem solve together. And saying, okay, I hear you. You're nervous that if this goes down and if this breaks, or if you don't deliver this thing on time, then your boss is going to look at you and your performance review is dependent on that. And like recognizing that that's a valid fear, right? And so it's recognizing the humanity, because I think what happens a lot of times we go, those people in business, those people in marketing, and we other people. Right? Without even realizing. Like, I think that's why like get blame got even baked in, because it's just so part of the culture. So then once you understand it, it's about joint problem solving and saying, okay, I understand that you're nervous about this. I can give you something that will give you something that is way beyond that, but I'm going to need an extra 2 weeks. Right? So it's getting really good at understanding other people and then also negotiating. Right? So rather than just taking requirements, it's being able to understand what somebody else wants and do a little bit of back and forth so that you're both getting a shared understanding and building something from there. So it's some of those types of skills that really go a long way. And then back to.
I'm curious what your favorite first 2 hours of the client look like.
Ooh.
Because I hear you, like, you gotta get the culture, but like, so like, what are your favorite ways to kind of broach it?
Yeah, so we actually don't go on site. We do everything distributed. We're a 100% distributed team. But we just onboarded one client, and it was like, I got really excited because the work that they're doing is really exciting, right? Like, I'm really into the mission. And then the culture was a really good match. Like, they got the way that we worked, and they already were doing that. And so it was neat because, like, for us, we set a maximum. So we tell people, like, you're not allowed to work more than 50 hours a week. Like, I cap it because I want people fresh, right? And after that, it's like, you know. So, and they had a very similar thing, right? And so we saw on our shared Slack channel, like, we were, you know, because anytime you do a client engagement, and there was somebody who was like, I'm taking a sick day, I've got a little cold, I'm going to go take a nap. And, like, that's what we do, too. So whenever I see kind of a shared culture, then I get really excited because I know we can do some really good work together. My personal involvement on clients, I tend to be more on the sales side, and then kind of involved in kind of the kickoff, and then my team kind of handles it from there. But one thing I do is we have what we call a code inspection, so it's kind of taking the metaphor of a house. And so we built a lot of scripts and different things like that to basically do a lot of static analysis. And so this is like the detective part. And so while a lot of the people on my team really like digging in and like getting the data and then kind of getting the analysis, what I love is translating that into business-friendly language that the CFO can understand. Like, that's my superpower in software, is that I can take really jargony stuff and I can translate it into a way that the people who are writing the checks go, oh, that's what cyclomatic complexity means? Okay, now I get it. Like that's, and so it took me a while because, you know, in some ways I'm like, oh, I'm not the most technical person in the room, but everyone's got their specialty. And I think that's the thing, is that the developers love that I love doing that, right? And I love that my developers like love diving in and doing these things. So it's again, that kind of whole team approach. So that's kind of me personally, and then also as a company.
When you pointed out hunting for treasure, I think what really struck me was when you consider the number of developers that can often be working independently with their own backgrounds and their own styles, what better way to find best practices and show as an example to others and share.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like almost like a retrospective of sorts to say, like, this was so efficient in this way.
Yeah.
And it was not. So
Yeah, one of the practices that we started doing too was everyone on our team keeps a daily log. I'm a Star Trek nerd, so like, I don't know, like the captain's log, like I was like, that's a good idea, why don't we do that? And then I also read some stuff about the Apollo mission, about how that's something that they did, where they kept these really detailed engineering journals, and then they would go around and like, that's how ideas would spread regularly. And so we were like, well, we'll just keep a GitHub wiki page for everybody, and like, we'll type up our notes like about what we did, and then share it with the rest of the team. And it's been so interesting because we've been able to do that exact thing. So somebody will talk in their log about, oh, I'm working on this issue, blah, 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 in C# and, you know, migrating Azure and stuff. And then somebody else will say, oh, I did that exact thing on another project 8 months ago. Here are my notes. And then they're like, thank you, you just saved me a ton of time. So there's absolutely ways to use that and think of it as an artifact that you can kind of pass down, for sure.
Thank you. So my team is going to be making, or actually is collecting information about whether to refactor or rewrite.
Yeah.
And my question to you is, in all the work that you've done, have you met code that you threw
Yes.
up your hands and said,
We have.
Rewrite?
Yes.
Can you say more?
Yeah. So what we usually suggest is that if what you have doesn't meet the needs of what you need, then a rewrite makes a ton of sense. So in our 10 years of business, we've recommended a rewrite twice. And the biggest one that comes to mind is that we had a CEO who came to us. It was a startup. They had a few users, but really not many. They hadn't even gone to their seed round. They were just still in angel funding, so they were like trying to figure out their product market fit. And they had a CTO, and the problem was that the CEO didn't understand why they couldn't hire talent. And so she was like, well, you guys say that you'll work on any language, any platform, anything. I've got this legacy code, and the CTO like tells me that he can't hire anyone. And so he's trying to figure out. So when we did our code inspection, we basically said, well, most engineers these days are looking for things that are using REST APIs, and this CTO was very dogmatic and wanted everything built in web forms. And so in that sense, what was already built, they didn't have any users. Like there was nothing that really, like the feature set, like they could reuse the roadmap, but the code itself, they weren't really going to be able to extract out. So it was funny. This has actually happened a few times. Like after we did our report, the CTO actually resigned and walked away. But the CEO somebody else came on, and now they're doing great, and they've got customers and stuff like that. So that's a good or a bad story, depending on your perspective. But we did our audit. like that's. Well, yeah. So, and I think part of it is like we try to just be honest about like why do you have this problem? You know, if you're building everything in this technology, which the people who are expecting one thing are getting something else, you're going to have a hard time recruiting. So, I just tried to explain the problem in as diplomatic a way as we could. So, yes.
Getting back a little to what he was talking about, but also getting more into it's very obvious when legacy code just doesn't work that it needs to get fixed, but other circumstances like reducing risk can be a little harder.
Yeah.
So you'll often find in legacy code that there'll be duplication that can
yes.
be, or things that work almost the same that can be made to use common code with some kind of switches, something like that, or some kind of scalability constraint where it's doing what we need it to do now, and it works perfectly with no bugs, but you need to do things differently in order to get past a certain scalability.
Yep.
Or adapt it to handle a new kind of client with just enough of a different need that it couldn't handle it.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. And so the things that we measure when we do our code inspection, like the main things, we're looking at test coverage, we're looking at duplication, we're looking at complexity, and we're looking at churn, and kind of how all those different things kind of interrelate. And yeah, exactly to your point, it's usually, kind of the big issues are stability, scalability, and security. So, yeah. You.
One other thing that we kind of realized as we did some refactoring to make the platform more scalable and whatnot, is that it gave us opportunities to go fix bugs which we had explained away through
Yeah, exactly.
You thought that you essentially led customers to believe that that's how the software functioned at that time. But
Yeah.
it shouldn't be that, and you really had an opportunity then to go and say, okay, this is probably not how it should have been done.
Yeah. 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 That's one of Scott's favorite activities is pruning a backlog. And like a lot of times what you'll find is there's like, 6 different things that are all describing this one issue. So like looking at something holistically can be really useful. And I think that's kind of what you found in the refactoring is like, oh, okay, like, kind of like cleaning a house, right? Like, oh, I noticed that, I've got all of this stuff. Maybe if I put it in a container and then put it in the closet, then it'll be easier to find later. So yeah, there's a lot of that. And it can be really fun. Did you find joy in that experience, like after it was done? Good. Yay. Yes?
Does anybody, when you interview people, do you have a sense that when you build software, it's like building a cathedral? And sometimes the skill set to actually recreate that cathedral is not there anymore because it was built a long time ago.
Yeah.
People do not write software the way they used to anymore.
They don't.
So do you see that as a value on doing legacy code?
What we interview for is a growth mindset. We interview people who are eager to learn and people who aren't afraid of challenges. So but I think part of it is that we're running into different constraints today. So we don't necessarily have to write code the same way that it was before.
Right, but then a lot of times, like the people who get educated now, try to solve different kind of problems. Like how do you make it look really great, like a swipe? People don't try to do like semiconductors anymore because that's like so there's no new innovation in a lot of the physics underneath it. Like the battery has been, not that great, not in the improvement wise.
Yeah.
So when you look at it, people make money faster doing something else. But then there are a lot of basic things still need to be done, which are in the legacy code.
Yeah, I mean, we have a lot of people who like love working in embedded systems. I know, Nancy, that's your thing. But yeah, we've got a lot of people who like enjoy that. Like Catalina, like that's her background. Like she's got a background in electrical engineering and like just really gets excited about kind of more of the lower level stuff. The types of work that we end up getting pulled in on are really more like if we do have a project that's older, it's about replatforming it. It's about how to make it modern. It's not about how to make it work the same way that it's been forever. It's about how to take this older system and move it up, doing the lift and shift work into the cloud or making it where it can consume, more RESTful APIs. So it is more of like a re-architecting. So even though you're working, like I would say it's kind of taking that cathedral and rather than keeping it the same or trying to build another cathedral that's exactly like it, it's about renovation and like figuring out how is it being used today. So it might be like taking a cathedral and learning to put central air into it because the needs change, right? So it's still the existing system, but there's something new that you're working with.
It's very hard to rebuild the whole cathedral.
Yeah, and a lot of times you don't have to, right? A lot of times you don't have to. There's just like a small part of it. It's that piece that's delivering the most business value that you really need to. But another analogy that I use sometimes is that a software system sometimes is like your body. Like this is my argument against doing a rewrite, and it's kind of a neat way to talk about the strangler pattern. So like at no point when you are asleep does your consciousness leap into another corporeal form, right? But with the exception of your eyes and pieces of your brain, your body is different on a cellular level every 7 years. Like your intestines rebuild themselves every 3 weeks, right? Like the cells like die off and change. And so this again goes to churn, right? It's like you can look at where are things changing constantly, right? Your bones, it's like 7 years, but like everything in your body, it's constantly changing and it's constantly replacing itself. So by paying attention to the things that are constantly changing within your software system, you want to make sure that things that are changing regularly are less complex because it's going to be easier to work with, and they've got a high degree of test coverage, and there's not a lot of duplication. So if you've got things like that's where to focus first because that's where you can get the most bang for your buck. So it's not necessarily about rewriting the whole thing from scratch. It's again about focusing on where you're going to get the most value, either business value or technological value, because you're focusing on things that are changing regularly. Yeah.
I think one of the frustrations of legacy code is the complexity problem. You have a very large system. How long does it take you to learn what you need to know to be able to change things in there? And I think one of the skills that's very useful is a sort of a black box.
Mm-hmm.
Saying,
yep.
I'm worrying about that.
Yep.
I'm going to assume it's going to continue to work. The tests are useful for that. But being able to focus on certain things and not trying to look at everything.
Yeah, I would agree with that. So, all right, one last question, and
yeah, for the products that you worked on, how much recertification needs to be done on the end product?
Like,
maybe if there are federal projects, let's say, and I'm thinking that you don't really go that route.
We have some federal projects. Because we don't go on site, we actually don't get a lot of federal projects. I mean, like, we're getting more and more, but when we set up the company, we live in a suburb of Richmond, Virginia, which is like out in the middle of nowhere, and that's where we wanted to stay. So we're like, we're not really going to be able to find developers to come to our tiny little town. So we knew that, like, in order to find talent, we would have to be distributed. So we set ourselves up that way. And federal government is just now getting to the point where we can do projects distributed. So a lot of it's like, if you can't come on site, they won't even talk to you. But in terms of certification, like, are you talking about the certifications that we're need? Like, there's a lot of different ways to interpret. Like,
well, I was thinking maybe primarily for federal use, there are certifications.
Yeah.
Look,
kind of like ISO stuff and yeah. I mean, so we've looked into that. Yeah. So I think okay. Yeah. So there are absolutely kind of rules and regulations that, like, we do a lot of stuff in healthcare, right, for example. So there's HIPAA compliance that needs to happen, right? Or there's a lot of stuff in credit cards. You need to have PCI compliance, right? That's just another type of documentation, and it's just another constraint that you need to consider. So, you know, within HIPAA, it's like, yeah, I could go out and, like, there are, you know, certified HIPAA people. We haven't gone that route, mostly because the expense, and we're a small business, and just it's not, I can't justify the cost right now. But, you know, I find people, and it's like, well, we have to sign in, we've got insurance, and basically if, like, we mess up, then it's on us kind of thing. So, so in terms of certifications, we haven't found that to be a real driver. Instead, it's more, can you deliver value quickly? Like, that's the thing. The federal government is lagging, though. They are lagging.
And as far as the embedded space, that's the same deal, right? You said there's development of embedded work.
Yeah, embedded work has been a challenge for us. Like, we've got a lot of folks who, like, love the embedded stuff, but again, like, on a distributed team, it's kind of a challenge, especially if you're working with a large, like, we were looking at a company that does, like, large medical systems. This is more up your alley. But it was, like, tough to do on a distributed team because in order to test it, we would have to have the physical device. So in that sense, it would make more sense to do it on site. So it's just, some of it is just the way that we're set up as a team. There are some projects that are kind of outside of what we do, but they're great for other people.
Yeah. Cool, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So, well, thank you all so much. I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to chat. Yeah, so I'll be around afterwards, so if you're an introvert and don't want to use a microphone, just know that I am more than happy to chat with you one-on-one as well. So thank you all very much.